I caught my wife putting powder in my drink before the will reading, so I handed her my glass instead. My second wife, Denise, 48 years old and 30 years younger than me, collapsed in the lawyer's office 20 minutes later while we were learning that my brother Marcus had left me $8 million. The doctors at Methodist Hospital told us she'd been poisoned with enough digitalis to stop an elephant's heart. And that's when I realized my wife of 3 years had been planning to make me a very rich corpse. If you've ever suspected that someone married you for your money, if you know what it feels like to catch your spouse literally trying to poison you for inheritance, if you've ever had to choose between trusting your wife or trusting your instincts when millions of dollars are at stake, pull up that chair and hold on tight. Because this story's going to show you that sometimes the most dangerous gold diggers are the ones who don't want to wait for natural death to claim their prize. And sometimes the only way to expose a killer is to let them drink their own poison. I'm Clarence Washington, 78 years old, been living in Memphis my whole life, and spent 52 years building Washington Logistics into one of the most successful black-owned shipping companies in the South. My first wife, Dorothy, and I were married for 47 years before she passed from cancer 5 years ago, and I thought I'd spend my remaining years alone with my memories and my 2 grown children from that marriage. That's when I met Denise at a charity gala downtown, a beautiful woman who seemed genuinely interested in my stories about building the business and my experiences growing up in segregated Memphis. She was articulate, charming, and appeared to share my values about family, community, and giving back to those less fortunate. When she agreed to marry me after a year of courtship, I thought I'd found a companion for my golden years. What I didn't realize until it was almost too late was that Denise had researched my net worth before we ever met, knew about my family's wealth, and was specifically targeting elderly widowers with substantial assets and no prenuptial agreements. My brother Marcus had tried to warn me about her motivations, but I'd dismissed his concerns as jealousy or overprotectiveness. Marcus died suddenly 3 weeks ago from a heart attack at 75, and his lawyer called to inform me that I was the primary beneficiary of his estate, $8 million from a brother who'd built his own construction empire while I was building mine in logistics. The will reading was scheduled for that morning, and Denise had been unusually excited about attending, asking detailed questions about inheritance law and estate taxes. That morning, when I caught her stirring white powder into my orange juice while claiming it was just vitamins for your blood pressure, was supposed to be the moment she secured her future as a very wealthy widow. Instead, it became the moment her murder plot backfired in the most dramatic way possible, when a suspicious husband's quick thinking turned a wife's poison into her own downfall. And if you're wondering how catching my wife trying to poison me before a multi-million-dollar inheritance led to attempted murder charges that shocked Memphis society, well, hit that subscribe button on Grandpa's Diaries. Because this story's about to show you that sometimes the people who promise to love you in sickness and in health are actually planning to ensure the sickness part happens much sooner than nature intended. And sometimes the best way to expose a gold digger is to let them dig their own grave with their own greed. Denise used to seem like a miracle after Dorothy's death, the unexpected blessing that appeared just when I thought my life was ending rather than beginning a new chapter. When we met at the St. Jude Children's Hospital fundraiser, she approached me during the silent auction, complimenting my bid on a vacation package and asking thoughtful questions about my late wife's involvement with the charity. "Mr. Washington," she said that first night, "I've heard so many wonderful things about Dorothy's work with children's causes. You must miss having someone who shared your passion for giving back to the community." Her sympathy seemed genuine. Her interest in my philanthropic work appeared sincere, and her respectful questions about Dorothy's legacy made me feel like she understood the importance of honoring my first wife's memory. I remember thinking that Denise was different from the other women who'd approached me at social events after Dorothy's death. She didn't seem interested in my money or my business success. She wanted to hear stories about my childhood in Orange Mound, my experiences during the civil rights movement, and my philosophy about using wealth to create opportunities for others. "Clarence," she'd say during our long conversations, "you've lived through so much history. Your stories are treasures that shouldn't be lost." Denise had a way of making me feel vital and interesting again, like my experiences and perspectives mattered to someone other than my children and business associates. She'd listen for hours while I described building Washington logistics from a single delivery truck into a company with 200 employees, and she'd ask intelligent questions about logistics, entrepreneurship, and the challenges of running a minority-owned business in the South. When I proposed to her after a year of courtship, it felt like the natural culmination of a genuine romantic connection. Denise had never pressured me for expensive gifts, never asked about my financial situation, and seemed content with simple pleasures like cooking dinner together or watching old movies. "Clarence," she said when I offered her Dorothy's engagement ring, "I don't want to replace your first wife. I just want to add a new chapter to your story." The wedding was small and elegant, held at my church with just family and close friends in attendance. My children, Sarah and Michael, were polite but reserved about my remarriage, probably concerned that I was being impulsive or vulnerable to manipulation. But Denise won them over with her apparent devotion to my welfare and her respectful attitude toward their mother's memory. What I thought was a loving second marriage was actually a carefully planned financial operation. Denise had done extensive research on my assets, my health conditions, and my family relationships before we ever met. She knew exactly how much I was worth, exactly how to appeal to my emotional needs after losing Dorothy, and exactly how long she was willing to wait before claiming her inheritance. The most heartbreaking realization was that every expression of love and concern had been calculated manipulation designed to position her as my heir without arousing suspicion from my family or friends. When Denise would massage my shoulders and tell me how much she loved me, she was probably planning the timing of my death. When she'd cook my favorite meals and fuss over my medication schedule, she was probably researching the most effective ways to poison someone with my health profile. The first warning signs appeared about 6 months after our wedding, when Denise started showing unusual interest in my will, my insurance policies, and my estate planning documents. She'd ask casual questions about inheritance laws, beneficiary designations, and tax implications of large asset transfers, always framing her curiosity as concern for our future financial security. "Clarence," she'd say during breakfast, "I've been reading about estate planning for older couples, and I'm worried that your assets might not be properly structured to protect our family if something happens to you. Have you considered updating your will since we got married?" Denise would bring articles about estate taxes, inheritance disputes, and the importance of clear succession planning, suggesting that my current arrangements might not adequately provide for her if I died unexpectedly. "I'm not trying to be morbid," she'd explain, "but at your age, we need to be realistic about planning for all possibilities." The pressure became more direct after Marcus mentioned that he was updating his own will to include me as his primary beneficiary. Denise's reaction to that news was immediate and intense. Suddenly, my brother's health became a frequent topic of conversation, and she'd ask detailed questions about his medical conditions, his lifestyle, and his life expectancy. "Clarence, Marcus doesn't look well," she'd say after family gatherings. "He's overweight, he drinks too much, and he's under a lot of stress from his business. You should encourage him to see a cardiologist before it's too late." Her concern for my brother's health seemed touching at the time, but I now realize she was calculating how soon she might benefit from his death. When Marcus died suddenly from a heart attack, Denise's grief seemed genuine and appropriate. She helped plan the funeral, supported me through my mourning, and made all the right statements about family loss and the importance of cherishing our remaining time together. But I started noticing that her questions about Marcus's estate were more detailed and persistent than seemed normal for a grieving sister-in-law. "Clarence, do you know if Marcus had updated his will recently?" she'd ask during the week between his death and the scheduled reading. "I'm just wondering if there are any surprises that might affect your emotional state. You've been through so much loss, and I want to be prepared to support you through whatever Marcus decided about his estate." Denise's behavior in the days leading up to the will reading became increasingly strange. She'd research inheritance law websites, ask detailed questions about estate taxes and spousal inheritance rights, and seem unusually excited about attending what should have been a solemn legal proceeding about my brother's final wishes. The morning of the will reading, Denise was up early, making breakfast and fussing over my medication routine with unusual attention to detail. She insisted on preparing my orange juice personally, claiming that she'd added special vitamins to help me handle the emotional stress of the day. "Clarence, this is going to be a difficult morning for you," she said. "I want to make sure you're as healthy and stable as possible." That's when I caught her stirring white powder into my glass when she thought I wasn't looking. The movement was quick and practiced, like she'd done it before. And when I asked what she was adding to my juice, her explanation about vitamins and blood pressure medication didn't match the furtive way she'd been handling the powder. For the first time in our 3-year marriage, I realized that my wife might be trying to hurt me rather than help me. The final murder attempt happened on the morning of Marcus's will reading, during what I thought was going to be a difficult but straightforward legal proceeding to settle my brother's estate. Denise had been unusually attentive that morning, insisting on preparing breakfast personally and making sure I took all my medications at exactly the right times. "Clarence," she said, while bustling around the kitchen, "today is going to be emotionally challenging for you, and I want to make sure you're physically strong enough to handle whatever Marcus decided about his estate. Let me take care of everything so you can focus on honoring your brother's memory." Denise had prepared my usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and wheat toast, but she seemed particularly focused on my orange juice, measuring out what she claimed were cardiac support vitamins that would help me handle the stress of the day. She explained that the supplements were specially formulated for men my age who had high blood pressure and recent grief trauma. "These vitamins are very potent," she said while stirring something into my glass, "and they need to be taken all at once for maximum effectiveness. They'll help stabilize your blood pressure and prevent the kind of cardiac episode that stress can trigger in elderly men." Something about Denise's behavior that morning felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too insistent, like she was following a script she'd practiced multiple times. She kept checking her watch and seemed anxious about making sure I consumed the juice at exactly the right time relative to our departure for the lawyer's office. "Clarence, you need to drink all of your juice right now," she said, pushing the glass toward me with unusual urgency. "The vitamins won't work properly unless you take them at least 30 minutes before we leave for the appointment." That's when I saw her do something that confirmed every suspicious instinct I'd been suppressing for weeks. While explaining the importance of taking the vitamins immediately, Denise turned away to check her purse, and I caught her quickly stirring additional white powder into my glass from a small vial she'd been hiding. The powder didn't dissolve completely, leaving a slight residue that definitely wasn't from any vitamin supplement I'd ever seen. Denise was adding something to my juice that she didn't want me to know about, something that required precise timing and careful measurement like a pharmaceutical preparation, rather than a nutritional supplement. While she was distracted with her purse, I quickly switched our glasses, moving mine to her side of the table and replacing it with her identical glass that had been sitting untouched. The movement was subtle and fast, and Denise didn't notice because she was focused on timing whatever medical procedure she'd planned to follow my consumption of the poisoned juice. "Drink it all, honey," Denise said, lifting what she thought was her harmless glass to demonstrate how safe the vitamins were. "See? It just tastes like regular orange juice with a slightly bitter aftertaste from the supplements." I watched in horror and fascination as my wife drank the poison she'd prepared to kill me. She drained the entire glass while maintaining eye contact, probably expecting me to follow her example and consume what she thought was my lethal dose before we left for the lawyer's office. We arrived at Attorney James Mitchell's office 15 minutes later, with Denise chatting normally about the day's schedule and her hopes that Marcus had remembered his family in his will. She seemed completely unaware that she'd just consumed her own murder weapon, and I was still processing the fact that my wife of 3 years had been planning to make me a very rich corpse before I could enjoy my brother's inheritance. 20 minutes into the will reading, just as we learned that Marcus had left me his entire $8 million estate, Denise collapsed in her chair, convulsing violently as cardiac glycoside poisoning began shutting down her system while the lawyer called 911, and I watched my would-be murderer experience the death she'd planned for me. At Methodist Hospital, the emergency room team worked frantically to save Denise's life, while I sat in the waiting room, trying to process the fact that my wife had just tried to murder me for inheritance money she thought I was about to receive. The medical staff initially assumed that Denise had suffered some kind of cardiac episode triggered by the stress of the will reading, but Dr. Robert Chen, the toxicologist who analyzed her blood work, immediately recognized signs of deliberate poisoning. "This woman has been poisoned with a massive dose of digitalis and other cardiac glycosides," Dr. Chen told the medical team. "The concentration in her blood is extremely high, enough to cause cardiac arrest in most people. Someone gave her a carefully calculated dose of heart medication that was intended to be lethal." I knew I had to tell the truth about what had happened, even though it meant admitting that my wife had tried to murder me on the morning I inherited $8 million. Detective Patricia Williams was called to investigate what the hospital had reported as a possible attempted suicide related to financial stress. "Detective," I said, "my wife didn't try to kill herself. She was trying to poison me with something she put in my orange juice this morning, but I switched our glasses when she wasn't looking. She drank the poison she prepared to kill me with, probably planning to become a wealthy widow before I could even claim my brother's inheritance." I explained Denise's suspicious behavior leading up to the will reading, her unusual interest in my estate planning, and the glass-switching incident that had occurred that morning. Detective Williams listened carefully, taking detailed notes about Denise's access to medications and her potential financial motives for murdering me. "Mr. Washington," she said, "what you're describing is attempted murder, motivated by inheritance greed. If you're right, your wife was planning to kill you immediately after you inherited your brother's estate, making her the beneficiary of both your existing wealth and your new inheritance." Within 24 hours, Detective Williams had obtained search warrants for our house, Denise's personal belongings, and her financial records. What she found was a murder conspiracy that had been months in the planning, research on untraceable cardiac poisons, calculations of lethal dosages, and detailed financial planning for my expected death. The search revealed that Denise had been acquiring Digitalis and other cardiac glycosides through online pharmacy sources, claiming she needed them for her elderly mother's heart condition. She'd been systematically stockpiling the drugs needed to cause a heart attack that would look natural in a man my age with existing cardiovascular risk factors. Detective Williams also found detailed research on my medical history, my insurance policies, and Tennessee inheritance laws on Denise's computer. She'd been calculating exactly how much money she would inherit as my widow, how quickly estate probate would be completed, and how to minimize tax consequences of inheriting both my existing assets and Marcus's $8 million bequest. The most damning evidence was a timeline Denise had created showing the optimal sequence for my death relative to Marcus's estate settlement. She'd been planning to kill me within days of the will reading, ensuring that I would inherit Marcus's money but die before I could change my own will to reduce her inheritance or add additional beneficiaries. But the most chilling discovery was a series of practice runs Denise had conducted, testing different methods of administering cardiac glycosides in food and drinks to determine the most effective delivery method. She'd been experimenting with poisoning techniques for weeks, calculating dosages and timing, to ensure that my death would appear to be a natural heart attack triggered by the emotional stress of losing my brother and gaining a large inheritance. The criminal trial took place 8 months later, after Denise had recovered from her self-inflicted poisoning and been deemed mentally competent to stand trial. The courtroom was packed with Memphis Society members who'd followed the case through extensive media coverage, shocked by the story of a gold digger trying to murder her elderly husband for inheritance money. Denise had hired the most expensive criminal defense team in Tennessee, lawyers who specialized in defending white-collar criminals and financial exploitation cases. Their strategy was to claim that I was a paranoid elderly man who'd misunderstood her legitimate attempts to help manage my medications, and that the poisoning was a tragic accident caused by supplement interactions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Denise's lead attorney said during opening statements, "this case isn't about attempted murder or inheritance conspiracy. This is about a loving wife trying to care for her elderly husband's health needs, and a tragic misunderstanding that resulted in accidental poisoning during a stressful family event." But their defense strategy collapsed under the weight of scientific evidence and Denise's own documented planning. Dr. Chen testified about the massive digitalis concentration found in Denise's blood, explaining that the dosage could only have resulted from deliberate preparation of cardiac poison rather than accidental supplement overdose. Detective Williams presented Denise's research files, showing months of planning for my murder and the detailed financial calculations she'd made about inheriting both my existing wealth and Marcus's bequest. The jury heard evidence about her systematic acquisition of cardiac glycosides and her practice sessions with different poisoning methods. The defendant wasn't trying to help her husband manage his health, the prosecutor explained to the jury. She was planning to murder him for money, timing his death to maximize her inheritance from both his existing estate and his brother's bequest. The fact that she poisoned herself reveals both the lethal nature of her intentions and the calculated planning behind her actions. My testimony was the most difficult part of the trial. I had to describe how Denise had manipulated my grief over Dorothy's death, exploited my loneliness to gain access to my wealth, and planned my murder while pretending to be a loving wife. "I thought I'd found a companion for my remaining years," I told the jury. "Instead, I'd married someone who was counting the days until my funeral so she could inherit everything I'd worked 50 years to build." My children, Sarah and Michael, testified about their concerns regarding Denise's motivations for marrying me, her unusual interest in family financial matters, and their observations of her behavior after Marcus's death. "We tried to warn Dad that something felt wrong about Denise," Sarah said, "but we never imagined she was actually planning to kill him." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial experts testified about Denise's research into inheritance laws and estate tax strategies. Medical experts explained how cardiac glycoside poisoning could simulate natural heart attacks in elderly men. Digital forensic specialists presented her online searches for information about untraceable poisons and murder methods. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. Denise showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, probably still believing that her legal team would find some way to reduce her sentence. Judge Robert Martinez sentenced Denise to life in prison without possibility of parole for 30 years. This court has rarely seen such a calculated and heartless example of matrimonial predation, he said during sentencing. The defendant married an elderly widower specifically to inherit his wealth, then planned his murder when inheritance through natural death wasn't happening quickly enough for her satisfaction. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentence was announced. Denise sat in stunned silence, probably realizing for the first time that her greed had cost her everything: her freedom, her reputation, and any chance of ever benefiting from the wealth she'd tried to steal through murder. 3 years have passed since that terrible morning when I caught my second wife trying to poison me for inheritance money, and life has taken on a peace and purpose that I didn't think was possible after experiencing such a profound betrayal of trust. Marcus's $8 million bequest has been used to establish the Dorothy and Marcus Washington Foundation, which provides scholarships for disadvantaged students and support for elderly people who've been targeted by financial predators. Denise is serving her sentence at the Tennessee Prison for Women, and she's never attempted to contact me since her conviction. She'll be eligible for parole when she's 78 years old, the same age I was when she tried to kill me. Probably too old and institutionalized to pose any further threat to vulnerable elderly people. Our marriage was annulled after her conviction, erasing any legal claim she might have had to my estate. My relationship with my children Sarah and Michael has been strengthened by this experience, as they've helped me process the trauma of realizing that someone I trusted completely was planning my death. They've also helped restructure my estate to ensure that future romantic relationships can't compromise my financial security or my commitment to philanthropic causes. My will has been completely restructured to ensure that no future romantic relationship can compromise my philanthropic commitments or create incentives for people to hurt me for money. Everything goes to charitable foundations and educational programs, with detailed instructions that no spouse or romantic partner should benefit financially from my death, regardless of how long we've been together. The most frightening part of this story is how easily Denise could have succeeded if I hadn't been suspicious enough to catch her preparing the poisoned orange juice. Gold diggers who target elderly widowers have tremendous advantages: access to their homes, knowledge of their routines, and emotional influence that can be used to manipulate medical care and daily activities. The dining room where Denise tried to poison me has been converted into a home office where I work on foundation business and correspondence with scholarship recipients. Every day I spend in that room represents a victory over someone who thought my death was worth more than my life, and a commitment to using my remaining years to help people who actually deserve assistance. The will reading that was supposed to be my last day alive became the first day of a new chapter dedicated to protecting other elderly people from the kind of predator I married. Marcus's inheritance, which Denise had planned to steal through murder, is now funding programs that help seniors recognize and avoid financial exploitation by family members and romantic partners. Tell me in the comments, have you ever suspected that someone was interested in you primarily for financial reasons? Have you ever caught a romantic partner or spouse doing something that made you question their true motivations? Have you ever realized that the people who claim to love you most might actually be planning to benefit from your death? And if this story reminded you to trust your instincts when something feels wrong about a romantic relationship, especially later in life when inheritance money is involved, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about surviving betrayal by people you trust most. I'll see you tomorrow with another cup of coffee and another truth about what happens when love meets money, and how sometimes the most romantic gestures are actually murder attempts in disguise.